Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our week 7 Modern Age from Islamic Perspective course. This will be a part 1. There will be few parts of this session, actually week 7. There will be few sessions. So inshallah, let's begin. Our objectives are Muslims in the World War, from colonies to the countries, Palestine and Israel, and Iran and Iraq. Before we get into details, I want you guys to go through a few words. Okay, so what is a discrimination? Discrimination is when a person is treated unfairly because of who they are or characteristics that they have, for example, because their religion, their race, whether they're a boy or they're a girl. So when you are treating someone unfairly just because how they look like, what do they wear, what color they are, right? What ethnicity they are from, or is it a boy or is it a girl, like whatever it is. So that is called discrimination. Now, as we were talking about World War I, and then in our last videos, we spoke about fascism and we spoke about Hitler, right? And also we spoke about the World War II. But I really want to go through a little bit, few of the videos of World War II before actually I get into Muslims in World War II. So let's see if I can show you guys some videos here. Give me a second. If I can show you, and that's going to give us a little bit of better, just a review, okay? A better perspective. Let me see if I can show it here. Okay. Here you go. So this is World War II.
With the Allied advances in the Ruhr Valley, the German army was on the run. Incendiary bombing reduced the industrial city of Wuppertal to rubble.
Every time I come in here, you're watching some World War II show.
100,000 refugees fled the firestorm, scattering into the countryside. Such was the sorry toll of total war.
Dear Tim and Moby, can you give me a rundown of World War II? From Primo. Oh, so now you're with me. World War II was fought between the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, the US, China, and a lot of other countries. Germany was the major aggressor in World War II. It was led by Adolf Hitler, a totalitarian dictator. That means he controlled every aspect of life in the country. Hitler rose to power as the leader of the Nazi Party, a German political party. The Nazis took control by promising a glorious future for Germany and stoking anger over the Treaty of Versailles, the peace agreement that ended World War I in 1919. Germany had agreed to pay huge sums of money to the winners and shrink its military way down. It also gave up big chunks of territory, one of which split the country in two. Hitler vowed to get revenge for this humiliation. He said the Germans were a master race, superior to all other people. It was their destiny to be the most powerful nation on earth. They would rule over the inferior races, which was basically everyone else. Hitler reserved a special hatred for Jewish people. He blamed them for Germany's problems, including the defeat in World War I. At first, the world stood by as Hitler began his quest for total power. No one wanted to spark another world war. In 1938, he sent troops into Austria, which gave up without much fight. A few months after that, he took over part of Czechoslovakia. It was hoped that he would be satisfied with these two conquests. But soon he was demanding the part of Poland that Germany had given up after World War I. Britain and France agreed to defend Poland against any aggression. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, both Britain and France declared war on Germany. At this point, the Soviet Union was actually on Germany's side. So the two countries divided Poland between them. The Soviets took the eastern part, while the Germans occupied the western half. The German army went on to defeat Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg. Then, over just 6 weeks in 1940, they overran the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Their style of war was known as Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. It was a fast, overwhelming invasion. Britain was left to fight the Nazis alone. The German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, used France as a base to attack England by air. When the British refused to surrender, the Luftwaffe began the Blitz. It was a relentless bombing campaign targeting London and other cities. But England's Royal Air Force, or RAF, managed to successfully defend their country. The U.S. stayed out of the fighting, but supplied England with naval support, weapons, and equipment. Germany expanded its alliances by signing the Tripartite Pact with Japan and Italy. Meanwhile, the Nazi regime had begun arresting, deporting, and killing Jews and other minorities. This was the start of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. You can learn more about that in our Holocaust movie. In 1941, the global balance shifted again. Germany broke its pact with the Soviet Union, launching an invasion of its former ally. It proved to be a fatal mistake. The Germans suffered huge losses fighting the massive Soviet army and the bitter Russian winter. They were forced to retreat. Plus, they secured themselves a new enemy, as the Soviet Union joined the global fight against them. Germany's chances of winning the war were getting very slim. But Hitler refused to give in. He would rather see his country destroyed than surrender. The United States finally entered the war after getting attacked on home soil. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed the naval port at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In response, the U.S. joined up with the Allies and sent troops to 3 areas or theaters of war. One was the Pacific Theater, to fight Japan in an island-hopping campaign. China had already been at war with Japan for years, resisting a Japanese takeover. In the Mediterranean Theater, the Allies fought the Axis powers in North Africa and Italy. And finally, a massive force of Americans, British, and Canadians was sent to fight in France. This was the Western Front of the European theater. More than 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel from Britain. They landed on the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944. This invasion is known as D-Day. The Allies sustained heavy losses but won a key victory. Germany was now trapped between 2 Allied fronts, Europe in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. After 5 years and millions of lives lost, the end of the war was finally in sight. German cities were flattened as the Allies pushed in from both sides. When it was clear there was no escape, Hitler took his own life. A week later, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. In the Pacific, the Japanese were still holding off American forces. President Truman took a drastic step to end the war. He dropped nuclear bombs on 2 civilian cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the only time the atom bomb has ever been used in war. Japan surrendered in August 1945. So, that's World War II. The basics. Does that answer all your questions? Well, that's what school is for. I have a life too, you know.
Okay, so that was a quick review on World War II, what was happening. Now let's move on. Our focus is, so that was the cause of World War II, as we talked about. Very quickly, if I go to what is a Holocaust? So the Holocaust was a period in history at the time of World War II, in between 1939 and 1945, when millions of Jews were murdered because of their who they were by Nazi Party. We have spoken about this in our last videos as well, but just wanted to have this a quick review. Now, who was killed or persecuted in the Holocaust? Jewish people, Roma and Sinti people or Gypsies, Slavic people, especially in the Soviet Union, Poland and Yugoslavia, disabled people, gay people, Black people, Jehovah's Witness, political opponents. So it's not only the Jewish people, whoever they found. Yeah, so the Second World War was slightly more complicated as Hitler specifically targeted also Muslim countries as allies. So we're going to talk about that as well. Let's see. So what is a genocide? So the Holocaust was an example of genocide, right? Because genocide is deliberately killing a large group of people, usually because they are a certain nationality or a certain race or a certain religion. We're going to watch World War II video later on again, and it's going to talk about a lot of stuff. So let's see, let's focus on Muslims in World War II. Now, the Second World War was slightly more complicated, as I was saying, because Hitler specifically targeted the Muslim countries as allies. If you remember this time, a lot of countries in the world were still colonized, right? If you remember, after World War I, Ottoman Empire fell. Now, then, or World War II, at that time, many Muslim countries, and in different countries, Muslims are living there. Now, many of the countries were really getting very dissatisfied with the colonial powers and wanted to have their own country again. Because they, the British, if you remember, they really didn't want to rule the countries very well. They didn't care about the people in those countries. They don't want any progress of those countries. All they wanted to just just break the unity of the Muslims, and break the power of the Ottomans, right? And then just so people were not happy because these colonial powers were not really helping them. Now, Hitler offered his support. So what Hitler did, he offered his support as he claimed, we have a common enemy. So he was saying the colonial powers are your enemy. Our enemy is also the colonial powers. Who are the colonial powers? England and French. Now, and then we have another common enemy, that is Jews, right? Now, is it right? Is it wrong? That's a different case. But they were trying to approach Muslims with this one. Many German soldiers had died in the war with Russia due to the severe winter colds. Also, the war was now expanding to the Muslim lands. Now, Hitler really wanted to get support from the Muslims for his cause because he needs soldiers. Now, the reason he was nice to the Muslims at the beginning was only because he needed support and soldiers. Now, on the side of the Nazis, what was going on the side of the Nazis? Now, only a few Muslim leaders would side with the Nazis as they fought against the Allied forces, mostly because, why? They believed that it would help them to get rid of the colonial powers. Hitler often expressed his respect for Islam and considered it a strong martial religion. However, many Muslims were killed by SS Nazi troops simply because their circumstances made them similar to the Jewish. Hitler himself has actually clearly stated in his book, Hitler's book is, its name of the book is Mein Kampf in Arabic. So he thought that Arabs were inferior, less than German people, because the Arabs' complexion was darker. So actually, even if he was trying to be nice with the Muslims that time, but he actually did not accept Muslims as a higher race than them or equal even. So lots of Nazi propaganda was actually targeting Muslims. The Nazi propaganda even used Quran and Hadith to convince Muslims to take the side of the Germans. They were using it in a different way, as the Europe Arabs and the Muslims would be divided into those who supported Nazis and those who fought against the Nazis, and those who did not do much but simply tried to survive. So if you think about it, so what was happening in Europe and Arab world? So do both sides. So some were, so here, as I said, as in Europe, Arab, and Muslim world, divided into three groups. So one who supported the Nazis, one who don't support Nazis, and one who do not match, one who do not do much about Nazis. Okay. Now, what was happening in in Jerusalem? Now, most of the famous cooperation between Arab and Nazis was with the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Hussein. Al-Husseini believed that working with Hitler was more beneficial for Palestine than working with British. Because do you remember what the British did in World War I? They had secretly promised Palestine to France. They have promised Palestine to Russia. They have promised Palestine to King of Saudi Arabia. And they also promised Palestinians to Hashemites in the Jordan. So they have and Jewish people as well. So they have, promised, Zionist. They also promised to the Zionists. So actually, so then that point, Al-Husseini, he thought, you know what, if I help and support Hitler, then that is better than if I support the British. Okay, so that was a stand there. Now, Britain has actually given Al-Husseini this high position, but once it was clear he was working with Nazis, what they did, they exiled him from Palestine. Now, on the other side of the, okay, how many? Now, about 233,000 North African soldiers were fought for France during World War II. During the end of the war, about half of the people killed fighting for France were Muslims, subhanAllah, and mostly from North Africa. Britain enlisted the help of Indian Muslims during the war. Staggering 500,000 Muslims fought in the British Indian Army. Other Arab states also contributed soldiers, and many Muslims from Russia, China, and Palestine fought for the Allied forces. So this is a very bizarre and very different situation for the Muslims, if you think of, because there is no personal cause for the Muslims to fight with each other. Just because they're living in a country where they are enslaved, they're enlisted, right? The colonial powers are making them, they have no choice. Like, when the British went to the India, they wanted soldiers, they just took soldiers, they took them, they had to fight. So this is how actually the Muslims actually got into these fights. So Muslims definitely were involved in World War II, but it was not because of forsake of Allah. It was not because of they were doing for their own land to rule, to bring Sharia law or do anything. It was because they had no other choice. Now, on the side of the Allied forces, now the overwhelming majority of Muslims supported the Allied forces, despite their resentment toward colonial occupation. Often Muslims and Jewish had lived side by side for centuries as neighbors. Also, many Muslims felt that the treatment Germans were giving people that did not cooperate was wrong. Muslims did not only fight as soldiers with Allied forces, they often also joined the resistance. The resistance was a network of normal people that worked together to help hide Jewish and send messages to the soldiers at front. Now, the resistance made life very difficult for the Nazis, and there are several beautiful and heroic stories of Muslims in resistance. Okay, now if we look into the Albania, one of the example, Albania was occupied by Italians in 1939 and later by the Germans. Many people in Albania were Muslim. Albania was one of the few countries that was safe for the Jewish during World War II. The interesting fact is that Albania had more Jewish at the end of the war than the beginning of the war. In 1933, Albania counted about 200 Jewish. At the end of the World War II, they had 2,000 Jewish living in their country. It is really impressive if you think about it. And because Hitler killed so many Jewish people that most countries ended up with less Jewish by the time the war ended. Now, in Albania, only 5 Jews, all from the same families, were killed during the war. From the top down, starting with the government, the entire country took effort in hiding the Jewish. Albania did not only help Jewish that were living in their country, many Jewish that fled other country came to stay in Albania. Now, did you know that Albanians would make it impossible for Nazis to discover the Jewish? They gave them houses, fake jobs, so they look like Albanians. Now, this is a video for the Blitz. Let's just watch this. I know we are talking about the Muslims here. I think I have already turned it on. Pause it here. Let's see what was going to as all this was happening. So now let's quickly see what was actually happening that time, okay?
In 1940, Adolf Hitler planned an invasion of Britain by air and sea called Operation Sea Lion. When poor weather conditions and logistical problems forced him to call it off, Hitler instead launched a massive aerial bombing of England. Thus began the Blitz. The Blitz, short for Blitzkrieg, lasted for 8 long months, despite the literal translation of the word being lightning war. Beginning in September 1940, the German Luftwaffe bombed 16 British cities. London got the worst of it, being bombed nearly 71 times, and at one point for 57 consecutive nights. The repeated intensive bombings claimed over 1 million homes and 40,000 civilian lives, and forced mass evacuations. Despite the damage and terror caused by the Blitz, the British managed to keep calm and carry on. The war effort and economy were relatively unaffected by the Blitz, which had been intended to break their morale and force their surrender. By May 1941, the British still refused to give in, and Hitler gave up his plan to directly invade Britain. He then turned his attention to Operation Barbarossa, a high-concept plan to invade Russia that turned out to be the beginning of the end of World War II.
Getting elected president is an expensive business. Campaign costs add up. There are advertisements to make, travel expenses.
All right, so let's see here. Let's get back to our slides. Okay. Now, if I go into the next slide, what does it say? Well, it's also another video. We can watch some of them later on. So now let's look into some main points, okay? Now, the US would support Great Britain and Russia by sending weapons, and Japan bombed US Navy ships and drew US into the war, as we know. From 1942, the Allied forces managed to push back Japanese invasion, the Russian invasions and North African invasions. On June 6, 1944, Allied soldiers entered France in Normandy, and that is called D-Day. Right? So that is, yes. So that was D-Day, and we know that victory in the Europe. So if you look into the map of Pacific Ocean here, right? So what was happening here? Okay. Now, if you look into the red lines here, this is the red line. Okay, this is covered. So what is this? If you look into the legend here, it says area controlled by Japan by 1942. So at 1942, Japan was actually controlling this area. All right. Now this is Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and states in that side. Okay. Now, when the ships from US Navy were bombed by Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the next day the US declared war on Japan. Now, the Hitler had signed an agreement with the Japanese, so he then declared war on US. So this when the war in the Pacific area started. The Japanese already controlled parts of China. If you look into there, which they had invaded in 1937, they determined to build up a new Japanese empire. They now advanced with fighting speed. By June 1942, Japan had actually taken over most of the South Asia and many of the islands in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, if you look into the map. So the countries that fought against Japan and Germany were known as allies. So where are allies? The countries that fought against Japan and Germany were known as allies. From June 1942, the allies began to push Japanese back across the Pacific. They also won important battle in another parts of the world, such as El Alamein in North Africa and Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. So the D-Day, we just saw the video, the D-Day. So on June 6, 1944, it is known as D-Day. The Allies made a surprise attack on the Germans in the northern France. Thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy. Slowly, they fought their way across France and reaching Germany in September 1944. So meanwhile, Russia troops were advancing into Germany from the east in April 1945. They reached the capital, Berlin. Hitler realized he was defeated and killed himself on April 30th. The Germans finally surrendered on May 8th, and that May 8th is considered VE Day. So what is a VE Day? VE Day is victory in Europe. All right. So although the war in Europe was over, fighting continued in the Pacific. And on the August 9, 1945, the US dropped the first ever atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. About 80,000 people died in the explosion. And 3 days later, another bomb destroyed the city Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrendered. Right. So we know that as the Allies advanced across the Europe, they found prisons or concentration camps where the Nazis had sent Jewish and gypsies and mentally ill or disabled people. Many of these people had been murdered by Nazis. As many as 15 million people may have died in this way. And this terrible event, we know it's called a Holocaust. So this is a video of Pearl Harbor. We're gonna talk about. We're gonna see the video, and that will be our end of the part 1. So before we go there, so reflection. So again, who were the fascist country? Germany, Italy, and Japan. And who were the Allied forces? Russia, US, and Great Britain. So the main points. So what are the main points that I was actually trying to say here? I was giving you guys a little bit of perspective what was happening during the World War II. At the same time, what was the situation of the Muslim world? So Muslims fought in both sides in the World War II. They had no choice, and they were not fighting for their own agenda. You have to understand, Muslims were already, Ottoman Empire already fallen. We don't have our own country. We don't have our own well, we had our own country, but we didn't have our own one leader, right? So, and then many Muslims countries, they were colonized by the Western powers or the French and British and others. So, and Hitler wanted Muslims to fight for him, and he manipulated the Hadith and the verses of Quran about about Jewish people, is whatever it says in there, and he tried to manipulate them. And then Muslims, some of the Muslim leaders, they thought, well, the British and the French are not really helping the colonial powers, so maybe if we help in German, then they might help us. But at the same time, other Muslim countries, they also saw like, this is just not right. Just because they are Jewish, it is a discrimination. It's a genocide they're doing, right? Like they're just killing these gypsies and mentally ill, or different group of people. They're just killing them. This is not right. So as a Muslim, we know that this is not right. It doesn't matter if they're Muslim or non-Muslim. If you see that somebody else is doing injustice to others, we have to step up and talk. We have to help. We have to prevent. So a lot of Muslims really did it. Now, we know that Albania saved many Jewish people, right? There was a grand mosque in Paris that gave a false paper to save them, actually. SubhanAllah, those were things were fascinating. So we would conclude our first video here. And then inshallah, we will go back to, continue second video. But however, before that, let's start. Let's watch a Pearl Harbor quickly.
Man, Every one of these crewmen is buried here with the ship. Dear Tim and Moby, I heard Pearl Harbor was the biggest surprise attack ever. Did America really not see it coming? Melanie. It's true, Melanie. December 7th, 1941 was a quiet morning at the U.S. Naval Base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The USS Nevada's band was starting its daily rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Some of the musicians got distracted by explosions in the distance. Target practice, they figured, or maybe a drill. Most everyone at the base assumed the same thing. On the band's final notes, the deck was sprayed with gunfire. The whole sky darkened with planes bearing the Japanese rising sun. They unleashed a fury of bombs, gunfire, and torpedoes. Our most powerful vessels, the battleships, were the main target. All 8 were hit, with the worst blast shredding the USS Arizona. More than 1,000 men went down with the sinking ship. There was no time to mount a defense, and the United States suffered a huge defeat. But it's not like the attack came as a complete surprise. For years, Japan had been waging an imperialist campaign. They were taking over territories in East Asia, creating an empire. In the decade or so before the attack, its size had increased more than 10 times. The wealth and resources from these areas were poured back into Japan's war machine, and that let them expand even more. Eventually, Japan's ambition to conquer all of Asia crossed the line. Its armies slaughtered thousands of Chinese civilians in the Nanjing Massacre. The world was outraged, but nobody wanted to get involved in a far-off war. Well, the U.S. was caught up in the Great Depression. The economic slump demanded most of the government's attention, and the losses of World War I were still fresh in Americans' minds. President Roosevelt promised to use peaceful means for dealing with Japan. Instead of resorting to force, Roosevelt tried restricting trade. America was still supplying Japan with most of its oil and steel. An embargo halting the shipments might stop Japan's military machine. Roosevelt also demanded an immediate withdrawal from China. Nope, Japan simply decided to get their raw materials elsewhere. And in 1940, they made a pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. Japan was now involved in World War II, which had begun in Europe the year before. Publicly, Japan and the U.S. still expressed hope of avoiding open warfare. They even held talks to negotiate a peace treaty. Behind closed doors, Japan's military leaders were hatching a different plan. Their prime minister, General Hideki Tojo, wanted to attack first. A preemptive strike could decimate America's Pacific Fleet. Japan would take the upper hand in a battle that seemed inevitable. Their head of state, Emperor Hirohito, had his doubts. But Tojo and his top admirals had made up their minds. Japan began secret preparations for the Pearl Harbor attack. Their pilots and sailors didn't even know what they were training for. But at dawn, on a tranquil Sunday, their mission was made clear. Over 300 Japanese fighter planes headed toward the Hawaiian base, just as American servicemen were starting their morning routines. Most servicemen had no time to get to their posts and defend the base. But there were some amazing feats of bravery that day. 2 off-duty pilots made it to their airfield before the Japanese bombers. They flew into the fray and shot down 6 enemy planes. Actually, Moby, it was just a drop in the bucket. Most U.S. fighters were destroyed before anyone could get to them. In just over 2 hours, Pearl Harbor was in ruins, with 2,400 Americans dead. It was one of the most devastating defeats in American history. Despite their lopsided victory, Japan made one huge miscalculation. They thought the fight would break America's spirit, undermining our will to fight. But, inspired by FDR, the public demanded action. Roosevelt called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Within a week, Congress declared war on all the Axis powers. The United States had officially entered World War II on the side of the Allied nations. Pearl Harbor severely weakened our Pacific naval forces. Japan immediately invaded territories America could no longer defend. It was months before the U.S. fleet was totally restored, and a year before ground troops managed to take back a single island. By the war's end in 1945, millions of people had died in the Pacific, and 2 Japanese cities had been destroyed by nuclear weapons. But Pearl Harbor's consequences were felt on the home front, too. Japanese Americans, particularly on the West Coast, were targets of racist policies. Their loyalty to the United States was questioned. Roosevelt forced hundreds of thousands of these American citizens into internment camps. They lived in shabby conditions under the constant watch of guards. Their livelihoods were ruined and their property seized, never to be returned. Yeah, wartime fears often bring out the worst in people, even while the stress of battle is bringing out the best in others. Like Samuel Fuqua, who led dozens of Arizona crewmen to safety. Afterward, he pulled sailors from the water while bombs were still dropping. That tragic day is filled with similar stories of grace under pressure. After World War II, America developed deep economic and cultural ties with Japan. They're now our closest ally in East Asia. And December 7th, 1941 is not so much a day of infamy, but a time to pay respects to old adversaries and to recognize our shared losses.
Okay, so that was end of today's session. Assalamu alaikum, jazakallahu khair. Inshallah, we will come back for rest of the topics in our part 2. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum.